Hello and welcome. Very good afternoon. You're watching The Big Story here on Mirror Now. I am Afrida Rahman Ali. We're going to focus on the back and forth that is going on currently between the high officials of the social media platform Twitter and the government of India. In fact, talks are scheduled between the IT secretary and the senior officials of Twitter operating in India. Before that, there has been an exchange, not just on Twitter, but also now on the indigenous app called Coup. So what has happened really is that microblogging giant Twitter has started blocking a portion of the accounts censured by the Indian government for allegedly carrying inflammatory content. 1,178 such accounts were flagged off by the government of India. The government asked Twitter to block all of these accounts. Twitter has complied partially to that order. In fact, initially Twitter said we will not be able to block the accounts, but now they have conceded some ground and blocked over 500 of them, saying that the remaining accounts cannot be blocked on account of the fact that they belong to politicians, activists, and journalists, which cannot be blocked. Before we bring you more details on this, let's in fact introduce our guest this afternoon who will help us understand the current situation and also give us more clarity on it. Ritesh Bhatia, cybersecurity expert, joining us here today. Good afternoon, Mr. Bhatia. Neha Joshi, spokesperson of the BJP, will also help us understand the government's position on this. Thanks, Neha Joshi, for giving us your time. Before I go across to my guests, I just want to bring some more clarity on the things that have happened in the sequence of events, because let's just put the facts out first. Twitter, in its statement, has said no action was taken on the accounts of journalists, activists and politicians as they believe that the government's order was inconsistent with the Indian law. So what it's essentially trying to say is that the government has overstepped the ambit of the law when it is asking for the disbanding or disabling of these Twitter accounts. Twitter has also asserted that the values that undermine free speech were increasingly under threat around the world and therefore dissent must be allowed to thrive. They cannot extend the disabling to accounts of journalists, activists and other politicians, since they believe that that would amount to stifling dissent and stifling free speech. So that is Twitter's reason for not fully complying with the government's order. And what is the government's response to this statement? Well, the Ministry of Electronics and IT has responded to this statement of Twitter for not fully complying with government's order, saying that it is unusual for the social media platform to issue a statement of this nature even before a dialogue has started. The talks are scheduled, like I say. The ministry officials will engage with the Twitter officials, and the government called Twitter's statement unusual and stated that it will share its response very soon. Now, this part of the response has come not on Twitter, but on the Coup app. Now, that's interesting. That's an indigenous platform. Again, making the Atmanirbhar pitch. The government has made a statement by posting it on the Coup app. So these are the many dimensions that we are tracking. I'll go across to Ritesh and Neha in just a bit. Ayushman, our correspondent who's brought us all this information, is live with us. Ayushman, very clearly, this is getting interesting, of course, and it's a very exciting and interesting, fascinating debate, because on one hand, of course, dissent must be allowed to thrive. It's a question of freedom of speech. But the government is very clear that there can be no compromise on maintaining public order. And in all this back and forth, tell us the important parts that we must focus on. And what about the dialogue going forward? Because there is a lot of exchange on social media platforms. But what is the plan of action ahead?
Well, Frida, if you see right now, the undemocratic nature, what the government calls of Twitter, social media giant, and also Facebook to some extent, is something that the government has been worried about, and they have conveyed it clearly that anything which is anti-India, which calls for genocide or violence, cannot go, and Twitter can't say that it abides by the rule. And if you remember, there are two instances. It was on 31st Jan, and second was on February 4, when the government shared 257 and 1178 list of accounts which were involved in the hateful propagation of tweet, which the government cited the evidences and shared the details with Twitter. Now, what Twitter did, they initially refused, but after some time, they said some amount of accounts have been removed. Then, today morning, when the dialogue was expected with the secretary as well as the ministers, the Twitter said that it came out with a comprehensive post in which it said that, quote unquote, it said it is doing it to keep the record straight. Now, the government has not taken it in the way it has been presented. It has said clearly that before meeting something of this nature, if it comes to fore, that makes the meeting unusual. So that is something. This announcement has been done on Coup, which is one of India's indigenous app, which won the Atmanirbhar Bharat challenge and currently has been hot preferred among several Indian ministers, as well as people are also migrating on that platform. But more importantly, sir, if you see, Afrida, if you see the situation right now, the government has made it clear that on Twitter there are evidences where people have gone on and there are agenda of anti-India being pushed by Khalistani elements as well as Pakistani elements. There are instances where the Twitter CEO has liked tweets of the ongoing farmers' protest, which somewhere does not go right into the spirit of neutrality which the platform stands for, and that's why they have given a caution and they want an explanation as well as action on this, to which the Twitter has responded, but that is something that has not gone down well with the government, Afrida.
Okay, thanks very much, Ayushman, for joining us. And since Ayushman has given us the position of the government, I'll go across to Neha in just a bit. I want a little bit of a clarity from Ritesh Bhatia first, because, Ritesh, like Ayushman said, and to be fair, let's not forget the likes of Deep Sidhu had resorted to videos on Facebook, which has galvanized support, and then we know what happened on the day of the Republic Day. Also to talk about the kind of provocative hashtags like the Prime Minister planning a genocide on farmers, all that is hugely damaging. And so if the government has exercised its right, in the interest of protecting public order, and has asked a social media giant to ban these accounts to protect protect the security for security reasons, why shouldn't the social media giant comply? I also want to understand from you, has the government overstepped the law as Twitter is alleging? Because that's the reason it's saying why it cannot go whole hog and ban all the accounts, because it says the government is inconsistent with its own law. Is that correct?
See, as far as, Afrida, I'm like a technical guy. I won't be able to comment much on the law part and the policies part of the government as such. But if you see, if Twitter is saying that the government has overstepped and, it is not understanding certain things and all, I would say this is like really double standards of Twitter also. I mean, you look at what they have done even in America when they like kind of, when they are talking especially about, the freedom of speech and the free speech. So why did they ban Donald Trump in that case? They could have suspended the account. They could have done like many more other things, kind of hidden his tweets. And, with the kind of technology they have, I'm sure they can do a many things. But then, Twitter has been like, not only Twitter, I would say the tech giants. I think they are, becoming more and more powerful. Of course, they are, but they are thinking they are above the democracies of the world, whether it's Australia, whether it's America, whether it is India. And that's a major threat. We have our government, respective governments. We are in our respective democracies. So, but then these people have no right. In fact, if somebody is overstepping, I would say it's them also who's overstepping. Now, coming to the government also, the government should have maintained a little more transparency by saying, okay, these are the accounts and these are the kind of things that they are there. They could have had an internal team also, like, which can really identify whether these are the bots, these are the fake accounts, and those ones could have been like kind of blocked for sure, and even if possible investigated, found out the IPs, the sources, and this message, I mean, should have been like come across to everybody that look, that this is what we have investigated, this is what the agencies have investigated, and these have been bot accounts, or these have been from, let's say, from Pakistan, from China, where maximum bots come from, and they should have maintained this kind of transparency. But as far as even Twitter is concerned, it has no choice as such, because if you see under 79A, they're supposed to like kind of abide by that particular law.
Yes, there is a global image that Twitter has to also perhaps conform to. It's stuck between a rock and a hard place, to use a cliche, because on one hand it cannot be seen to be arm twisted by the government of India, And on the other hand, it has perhaps the compulsions of a market of the magnitude of a country like ours. Neha Joshi, there are two things that Twitter is saying. A, that the government is not consistent with its own laws. And secondly, it is saying that we cannot stifle the voices of politicians, activists, journalists. So even though the government wants all 1,178 accounts banned, Twitter has used its own discretion to ban only 500 plus. Now, the government obviously is not happy with it. Because as we just heard Ayushman also telling us, it is saying that what's the point asking for a dialogue if you have already decided you're not going to ban these accounts. Now, under the circumstances, what's the last resort? What can you do? Are you going to ban something like Twitter in India? Yes, we are not able to hear Neha, I think. There's some issue there. I'll come back to Neha.
Can you hear me, Afrida?
Yes. I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Good afternoon. And first of all, I'm already on Coup, and I hope you're too. So I'd love to connect with you over there. Now, coming to the point of this debate, as far as I understand, Twitter is a private company and it has no authority to interpret the law. So the comment from Twitter that the government has overstepped the law, they can approach the courts if they feel that they've been wrong. But to issue a statement that the government has overstepped, that I feel is inherently wrong. Now, the Twitter cannot decide.
Okay.
Partial compliance with the law cannot be called as compliance. You can't decide what part of the order to defy and what not to defy. And the statement that Twitter has issued, in which it names media entities, journalists, activists, and politicians. So basically, Twitter is going to decide what is hate speech and what is not based on the stature of the person who has tweeted. Now, that to me inherently seems wrong. So if you're operating in a country and there's a certain law that you have to abide to, that should be sacrosanct. And like, the gentleman before me said, if Twitter stands for free speech, it banned Donald Trump when he was still the president of the United States of America. So clearly, this isn't about free speech. And, Frida, I'd like to make this very important point here, that freedom of expression as guaranteed by the Constitution of India is not absolute. The same Constitution also mandates that the government has to act upon you if you threaten the integrity of the nation. So, when the freedom of expression is not absolute, how is it that Twitter decides who to ban, who not to ban, which accounts to sanction, which accounts to not sanction? I think there are, if somebody has to decide that what I'm saying constitutes hate speech or I should be banned, I would rather have the judiciary in my country decide that than a white man sitting in California. That just doesn't sit well with me as an Indian.
Okay, so on the question of who regulates, I think there can be no dispute. Yes, the government is mandated to regulate to a certain extent in the larger interest of the country, but the question of how would you regulate, to what extent? OTT platforms are supposed to be self-regulated. There again, the government has decided to step in. So those questions remain, that, all opinions should be welcomed. Dissent must be allowed to thrive. There is a fundamental right of freedom of speech, and therefore all those voices must be heard. At the same time, one cannot stake national security. After what happened on Republic Day, the government is not willing to take chances, so there may be a fair point there. I've run out of time on this. Thanks very much, Ritesh Bhatia and Neha Joshi, for joining us on this discussion.
Thank you.